just one news story for the last week of Sustainable September. This story, in fact, comes from Curtin University, where researchers have trialled a technique that they call deep listening as a tool to encourage pro-environmental behaviour and create social bonding among young people. The technique, based on a neurological phenomenon that they call the Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, or ASMR. Anyway, in plain English, what they're doing is that they are pairing positive messages about actions that can be taken by every one of us in our daily lives to protect the environment. They're pairing this with the environmental and auditory stimuli found to create a positive mood. Well, the researchers comment that because so much of the message about climate change and environmental degradation is, let's face it, negative and rather gloomy, young people feel overwhelmed and depressed rather than galvanised into action. And not, I suppose, just young people. Presented in a way designed to stimulate the brain response of ASMR, the researchers found that their young subjects were more ready to hear the optimistic message that change, in fact, is possible. Many of the participants who, before watching this video, felt overwhelmed by climate change, afterwards reported feeling confident and encouraged to act. And so I guess the take home for us is that it matters, not just what we say about the challenges we face, but how we say it. And we need to allow people the opportunity to process their feelings and to learn that they do, in fact, have some control to affect the environment around them. Well, in our reading this morning from the book of Exodus, the people are grumbling. Again, after the excitement of escaping their slavery in Egypt by taking off out into the desert, after the excitement of following Moses across the Red Sea on dry land and then watching their pursuers perish as the waters closed back over them, the people of Israel now find themselves, well, in the desert, with no means of support, no food and no water. Actually, as Australians, we know this scenario, don't we, in our dry continent. The early white settlers in Australia found the desert frightening. They found it a hostile and unnerving place, but of course Aboriginal people who have for tens of thousands of years lived in the vast Australian deserts know that the desert does, in fact, have food and water in plenty. The original inhabitants of the land know the landscape and they respect its limitations. They know that their own lives are held within the fragile beauty of the land. And they also recognise a reciprocal obligation to care for the land that provides for their needs. The people of Israel, on the other hand, in today's story, are out of place. Nomadic herders, they're used to land that has grasslands and waterways to graze animals. They are fearful. And you'll remember that in last week's reading, they started to grumble. They grumble first and foremost at Moses. Well, like any good pastor, Moses recognises the blame game and he knows that they are actually grumbling against God. Why are you testing God? He asks them, clearly supposing that they should have had a bit more faith. That the one who led them out into the desert can also be trusted to supply their needs. The people demand bread and meat, and in today's reading, they demand water. Well, to be fair, their demands aren't particularly excessive, are they? They simply want the bare basics to sustain their lives. They demand bread and God gives them manna, just a day's supply at a time. They demand meat, and God gives them quail. They demand water, and God shows Moses where to strike the rock to release an underground spring. The desert supplies their needs, and the God who created them in love also sustains them in this new and frightening landscape. This unsettling place of transition between the old and familiar but oppressive land of Egypt and the uncertain future as they journey towards the land to which God has promised to lead them. The people of Israel are adjusting. They're learning the new realities of the land in which they find themselves, but they haven't yet learned their own role. They've not yet learned how to live in harmony with the wilderness. They are testing God. And God, it seems, is also testing and instructing them. God will provide food, drink, and guidance in the wilderness. Israel, for its part, has to learn to trust. Well, I wonder if you're starting to get the idea of what my sermon's going to be about today. One of the puzzles for readers of the stories of the desert wanderings in Exodus and Numbers is the way that the challenges for the people are repeated. They are doubled up a bit later, but with different outcomes. Sometimes God simply meets their needs and gives them what they want. But then when the same story is repeated later, the people are punished for their disobedience. This story, the story of the people's thirst at Massah and Meribah, actually is repeated in the book of Numbers in chapter 20. And at first glance, it looks like the version in Numbers is just a repetition of today's story of water gushing from the rock, except that it has a very different ending. Because in Numbers, after providing water for the people to drink, God tells Moses that because the people did not trust God, then God will not trust Moses to lead the people into the land that He's promised. And then in the following chapter, when the people are still grumbling for water, God, clearly having had enough, just sends poisonous snakes instead. What's going on? I mean, these are strange stories, aren't they? But what's going on? You might think, I guess, that it's because they keep grumbling and they don't learn. And that's fair enough. At first, God provides for their needs and teaches them that God can be trusted. Later, the people who haven't yet learned the lesson of trust seem to be reaping the consequences of that. But my Bible commentary points out also that this story in the book of Numbers comes immediately after the law has been handed down on Mount Sinai and God has made a covenant with the people. Well, the priestly writings of the Old Testament, of which this passage is a part, the priestly writings have a theology that assumes that the land will be fertile and the land will provide for the people's needs just so long as the people are faithful and remember their responsibilities under the covenant that they have made with God. But it seems that in the story of Numbers, having made a covenant with God, the people of Israel, continue to behave like children who actually don't recognise any responsibility of their own. Israel clearly still has some growing up to do. Well, we grumble, don't we? We grumble and we feel overwhelmed about the realities of the climate crisis with all of its related catastrophes of species extinction and threats to food and water security, and yes, pandemic too. Hands up if you're not overwhelmed by that little lot. We're overwhelmed. Though, of course, to be fair, the warning signs have actually been around for about 120 years now. Did you know that? Back in 1895, a Swedish scientist by the name of Svante Arrhenius published a paper in which he warned that with the increasing emissions of carbon dioxide, that's going to affect the global temperatures. And scientists have been working to clarify and expand this knowledge for over a century now. The warning signs have been there, and we all of us do know, don't we, the link between the state of the environment and our own actions. Which is to say that we, humanity generally, I mean not just us, we continue to behave like children who don't want to accept our own responsibility and who refuse to adapt so that we are able to live in harmony with the earth. Like the people of Israel in today's reading, we find ourselves in an unfamiliar place. We find ourselves in a transitional place where everything that is familiar seems to have become unfamiliar as we journey towards a future that increasingly feels uncertain. And we need to learn new ways of living in harmony with God's creation, as well as, even more fundamentally, a deeper relationship of trust in God. The Exodus reading that we heard this morning reminds us then that actually we do have a covenant. We do have a covenant that connects us with one another, that connects us with the earth, our mother, and that connects us with the God who created us in love. We can rely on God to be faithful to God's promises. But we also have some responsibility ourselves to be wise and careful stewards. How we are in relation to the earth that sustains us, I'd like to suggest, actually has everything to do with how we are in relation to the God who created us. So to get back to my original question, how can we hear the words of warning and the call to be better stewards of God's creation without being overwhelmed, without being defensive and grumpy and, sticking our fingers in our ears? I think the answer, to take at least the sense of the Curtin University study, I think the answer is to hear the call to be better stewards within the overarching message of God's love. God's love not just for ecosystems and habitats and wild creatures, but God's love for us personally. To hear the encouragement to love and care for God's creation as the leading of a loving Creator who wants us to assume our responsibilities as grown-up partners in creation. To recognise that this divine nudging is for us to grow up and take on our responsibilities as stewards of creation, that this divine nudging is intended for our good and for our growth. To hear, in other words, to hear the encouragement within the love song that is the murmur of God's Holy Spirit within and around us. We're invited into the full meaning of our human vocation and with the covenant relationship that we have with God that connects our lives with the life of the earth and all of its creatures. So we are invited to take more care of our own footprint on the earth. We're invited to rethink how we live, the choices we make in how we invest or how we consume or how we travel or vote. But fundamentally, we are also invited to trust that the one who created us and all things in love, that God will be with us as we travel, and that God will guide us and sustain us as we go.